They say death is the one certainty in life. But if that's true, why does it still feel like such a shock when it comes close? Not just when someone we love dies, but when we face the truth that we, too, are running out of time. Maybe it hits you late at night, maybe in a hospital room, maybe in the silence after a funeral. That deep, haunting question, what happens when it's all over? We try to distract ourselves. We chase goals, comfort, success, even spirituality, but the fear still lingers underneath it all. Not the fear of pain, not even the fear of death itself, but the fear of vanishing, of no longer being me, of being forgotten, of our stories, our love, our names, wiped away like footprints in the sand. This video isn't here to give you easy answers. It won't promise heaven or threaten hell. It won't offer beliefs you have to swallow whole. What it will offer is a chance to see things differently. For more than 2,500 years, Buddhist wisdom has gently invited us to look, not outward, but inward, to question the stories we've been told about death, and more importantly, about life. Because maybe the problem isn't death. Maybe it's how we've misunderstood it. Maybe, just maybe, what we're really afraid of is the truth. And if we can face that truth, quietly, honestly, with open eyes, then something incredible happens. The fear loses its grip, and we begin to live, not from fear, but from freedom. So if you've ever wondered why death feels so heavy, if you've ever wanted to let go of that quiet panic, then stay with me. This is the beginning of something much deeper than answers. This is the beginning of understanding. And with that understanding comes peace. The hidden fear behind death. At some point in our lives, we're all confronted with it. A phone call in the middle of the night, a diagnosis that changes everything, a moment when someone we love disappears and the world feels hollow. In those moments, death stops being an abstract idea. It becomes real, and with it, a heavy silence settles in. What is it that grips us so tightly? Why does something so natural still feel so terrifying? We often say we're afraid of dying, but most of us aren't truly afraid of the physical process. We understand that bodies wear down, that hearts stop, that breath fades. What shakes us to the core is something far more personal, the fear of no longer being, of becoming nothing, of vanishing without a trace. I once sat with a man in his late 60s, moments after he was told he had only weeks left to live. He didn't cry or ask, "Why me?" He just whispered, "I don't know who I am if I'm not here anymore." That fear wasn't about pain. It was about disappearing, about everything he'd built, all the roles he'd played, slipping away like sand between fingers. Think about how much energy we invest in the story of me. We build careers, relationships, identities. We hold on to labels, achievements, memories. We say things like, "This is who I am," and "I would never do that." And over time, this story becomes sacred. So when death approaches, it doesn't just threaten our body, it threatens the story. And that is what truly frightens us. But what if that story was never as solid as we believed? What if this self we've been protecting wasn't a fixed thing, but more like a pattern, a temporary formation, like a wave on the ocean, real in experience, but not separate from the sea? The Buddha saw this clearly. He didn't promise eternal salvation or offer comforting fantasies. He pointed to something far more liberating, that the self is not what we think it is, that we are not separate beings, but shifting processes, bundles of sensation, perception, thoughts, and awareness, rising and falling, moment to moment. Even modern psychology echoes this. Dr. Bruce Hood, a neuroscientist and author of The Self-Illusion, wrote, "The self is an illusion created by the brain. It feels real, but it's not a fixed entity. Still, the fear remains because we cling. We've spent a lifetime defending the self, building walls around it, convincing ourselves that it must be preserved. We fear death not just because it ends life, but because it ends me. Just like a child losing their favorite toy, not simply because it's gone, but because they felt it was a part of them. But here's the paradox. The more tightly we hold on to the self, the more fragile we become. The more we try to preserve something that was never meant to last, the more we suffer. And that suffering creates the very fear we're trying to avoid. What the Buddha offered was not a way to escape death, but a way to meet it without fear. He invited us to look not at death itself, but at the illusion of permanence we've built around the idea of me. To see that what we truly are can't be owned or lost, because it was never fixed in the first place. And when we begin to see this, not just understand it intellectually, but truly feel it, something shifts. The fear begins to loosen, the panic softens, and a quiet sense of freedom emerges. Because the I we're so afraid of losing was never truly separate to begin with. In that understanding, death becomes less of an enemy and more of a mirror, showing us what has always been in motion, always changing, always free. What is the self, and was it ever real? When we talk about death, what we're really talking about is the end of something deeply personal, the end of me. That's the root of the fear. Strip away the religious doctrines, the philosophies, the rituals, and beneath it all lies a single question that haunts almost everyone. If I die, what happens to me? But most of us never pause to ask, what exactly is this me I'm so afraid to lose? We think we know. We say, this is who I am, or that's just the way I've always been. We define ourselves through memories, roles, titles, and preferences. I'm a mother. I'm a teacher. I'm a leader. I'm a free spirit. These identities give us structure. They make the world feel predictable. But what happens when they fall away? I once met a woman who had just retired after 35 years as a teacher. Her students adored her. Her work gave her purpose. But just weeks into retirement, she fell into a quiet depression. If I'm not Mrs. Campbell the teacher, she whispered, then who am I? And her story isn't unique. I've spoken with CEOs who lost their companies, only to lose themselves. Mothers who watched their children leave home and no longer recognized the person in the mirror. Soldiers who returned from war but couldn't find their place in peace. When what we do disappears, so does who we think we are. That's when the panic sets in. Not because of the loss itself, but because it reveals the truth we've been avoiding. Our sense of self is more fragile than we'd like to admit. The Buddha saw this clearly. He taught that what we call self is not a fixed thing. It's a bundle of 5 constantly changing elements: body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. These rise and fall like waves. None of them are solid. None of them are truly ours. And yet, we spend a lifetime clinging to them. Modern science echoes this. Neuroscientist Anil Seth calls the self a controlled hallucination, a story the brain tells itself to stay organized. It feels continuous, but it's not. It's constantly being reconstructed. In psychology, this is called the narrative self. We are the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. But stories can shift. They can break. They can be rewritten. Still, we hold on, because we're afraid that if we stop believing in the story, we'll vanish, that there will be nothing left. But what if the opposite is true? What if the self isn't something to protect, but something to see through? Imagine a wave rising from the ocean. It has a shape, a rhythm, a direction, but it was never separate from the water. It didn't begin when it appeared, and it doesn't end when it crashes. It simply changes form. The self is like that wave. It feels real in experience, but it's not a thing. It's a process, a momentary dance of elements. And we suffer not because the wave ends, but because we try to freeze it in place, build an identity that doesn't move, that doesn't age, that doesn't die. As the philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin once wrote, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. This doesn't mean we disappear. It means we were never the thing we thought we were. Not the roles, not the memories, not the fears. What remains is not a fixed I, but awareness itself, spacious, flowing, beyond control. So the real question isn't what happens when I die. The real question is, who was I before the story began? And if that story was never truly fixed, then who are you when you stop telling it? Death is not the end, it's change. We grow up thinking of death as the final chapter, a curtain drop, a full stop, something that takes everything and gives nothing back. For most of us, death feels like an intruder, sudden, unfair, absolute. And that's exactly why it terrifies us. But maybe death doesn't deserve that reputation. Maybe it isn't an ending at all. Maybe it's a continuation, just not in the way we expect. One afternoon, I sat with a man in his early 50s who had recently been laid off after 2 decades with the same company. His shoulders slumped, his voice hollow. He didn't say, "I lost my job." He said, "I don't know who I am anymore." That loss was more than financial. It was existential. It felt like a kind of death. But months later, he surprised himself. He started gardening, then painting, then reconnecting with his kids. "It's strange," he told me. "I thought I had died, but something else showed up." He hadn't ended. He had changed. That's the essence of what the Buddha taught. Life and death aren't two events separated by time. They're two sides of the same moment. Like the inhale and the exhale. One becomes the other. They depend on each other. They are each other. What we fear as death is really just the latest transformation in a cycle that's been happening since before we were born. Cells rise and fall. Thoughts come and go. Relationships begin and end. Nothing stays. And yet, we resist this natural flow, clinging to the illusion that we are the exception, that we should last forever. But nothing in nature behaves that way. A flower doesn't fight its fading. The tide doesn't resist the shore. Even the stars are born and burn out in time. Everything belongs to the rhythm of change. And we are not separate from that rhythm. We are it. Modern science reinforces this beautifully. The first law of thermodynamics tells us energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. We don't vanish. We become. The body returns to the earth, the breath to the wind. The warmth we shared remains in the lives we touched. Nothing is truly lost. It simply changes form. There's a line by Haruki Murakami that says, "Death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it." And when you really let that in, something softens. You begin to see death not as a thief, but as a teacher. A reminder that every moment we experience is precious because it will not last. That we don't have forever to speak the truth, to forgive, to be kind, to pay attention. In Buddhism, monks meditate on death not to dwell in sorrow, but to wake up to life. To see clearly. To let go of the fantasy that anything here is permanent. Because once you see how temporary everything is, you stop wasting time on things that don't matter. You stop postponing what does. I once heard someone say, "I used to fear death. Now I fear not fully living before it comes." And maybe that's the point. Maybe death isn't here to scare us, but to sharpen us, to make us honest, to help us live as if time is sacred, because it is. So perhaps death isn't a wall we crash into, but a doorway we pass through. Not a void, but a return. A return to something bigger than this temporary form. A return to stillness, to nature, to presence itself. And if we truly understand that, not just in our minds but in our bones, then death loses its power to haunt us. It becomes less of an enemy and more of a mirror. A mirror that reflects the only truth we ever needed to see, that life is change, that we are change. And that's not something to fear, it's something to embrace. The root of suffering, holding on too tightly. We tend to think that suffering comes from dramatic moments, divorce, death, betrayal, loss. But the Buddha pointed to something quieter, something deeper. He taught that suffering doesn't just come from what happens to us. It comes from how tightly we hold on to what was, not the pain itself, but our refusal to let go of what we thought should last forever. And we hold on to everything, to people, to identities, to expectations. We grip hard because we're scared. We fear change. We fear losing control. We fear becoming someone we no longer recognize. But like sand slipping through our fingers, the tighter we grip, the faster things fall away. I once met a man who was going through a painful divorce. His wife had left 2 years earlier, but he still couldn't stop replaying their life together. He wasn't just mourning the relationship. He was mourning the version of himself that only existed in that relationship. "I'm not even sure who I am without her," he said. That pain wasn't just heartbreak, it was identity loss. The death of a story. And it hurt because he was still trying to live inside it. We've all done this. We cling to youth even as time moves forward. We hold on to a job title long after it no longer fits. We grasp at a dream we outgrew years ago, simply because we once said it out loud. We carry old wounds, not because they're still bleeding, but because we've built our personality around them. You see it everywhere, even in the stories we watch. The aging rock star who can't let go of their glory days. The character in a film still chasing the love that left years ago. The hero who doesn't know who they are without the war. We don't just fear change, we fear being no one without what we've held on to. But the truth is, clinging only creates more pain. The more we resist what is, the more we suffer. The Buddha compared this to being shot with an arrow, and then choosing to shoot ourselves again by asking, "Why me? Who did this? How could it happen?" Instead of pulling the arrow out, we stay stuck in questions and resistance. And the poison spreads. He taught that all things are impermanent, that everything we love will eventually change, fade, dissolve. Not as a punishment, but because that is the nature of reality. When we understand this, not just intellectually, but in our bones, we begin to loosen our grip. And in that loosening, suffering starts to ease. Modern psychology echoes this wisdom. Dr. Kristin Neff, one of the leading voices in self-compassion, says that people often chase control because they believe it brings safety. But in truth, peace comes not from controlling life, but from allowing it. We find calm not by holding tighter, but by letting things be. There's a beautiful line from Eckhart Tolle that captures this perfectly. Sometimes letting things go is an act of far greater power than defending or hanging on. Letting go doesn't mean we stop caring. It means we stop trying to freeze what was never meant to be permanent. We love, but we love with open hands. We give, but without needing to own. We grieve, but we don't become the grief. So much of our suffering comes from one simple illusion, that we can make the impermanent permanent. But nothing here lasts forever. Not youth, not success, not even the roles we play. And when we try to hold them in place, we suffer. But what if we didn't need to? What if, instead of fighting the current, we allowed ourselves to float? Letting go doesn't mean losing. It means trusting. It means choosing presence over control. And sometimes, it means simply breathing, without demanding that life look any different than it does. So just for a moment, ask yourself, what would happen if, today, you loosened your grip and trusted the flow? How death makes life more precious. There's a strange paradox at the heart of being human. We try to ignore death, and yet, it's death that gives life its sharpest meaning. We rush through our days, endlessly busy, often forgetting that this moment, this breath, will never come again. But when death brushes close, when we lose someone, or even when we imagine our own ending, something changes. Everything becomes clearer, sharper, simpler. What once felt ordinary suddenly feels sacred. There's a story told about a monk who would begin each morning by silently reminding himself, I may die today, not as a morbid ritual, but as a way to wake up, not just from sleep, but from forgetfulness. Because when you carry death on your shoulder, you tend to live differently. You speak more honestly. You forgive more easily. You hold the people you love a little closer. And you let go of things that, in the end, don't really matter. Death has a way of cutting through the noise. We spend so much of our lives chasing things, success, attention, possessions, as if they will protect us from the impermanence we fear. But when you sit at someone's deathbed, none of that seems to matter anymore. What matters are the small things, the moments of kindness, the laughter, the love we gave and received, and whether we truly showed up for our own life while we had the chance. There's a quiet power in remembering that. Time is not guaranteed. That each morning we wake up is a gift, not a promise. And when we stop assuming that we have forever, we begin to appreciate the now. The sound of a loved one's voice, the softness of sunlight through a window, the joy of sharing a meal with someone who understands you. None of these moments are grand, but when we realize they won't last forever, they start to glow. Buddhism teaches that impermanence is not a flaw, it's the nature of all things. And it's because things don't last that they become meaningful. A flower is beautiful not despite the fact that it wilts, but because it will. A song moves us because it ends. And love, real love, exists precisely because we know it's fragile. Steve Jobs once said, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." He wasn't being dark. He was being awake. Because when you know your time is limited, you stop waiting for the perfect moment. You start living. The Buddha encouraged this kind of reflection, not to scare us, but to wake us up. He often reminded his followers to contemplate death regularly, not to detach from life, but to deepen their presence in it, to stop squandering precious time in anger, in envy, in grasping for things that cannot stay. A wise teacher once said, "We are not afraid of dying. We are afraid of not having lived." And that fear is real, because deep down, most of us know that we've been putting things off, that we've been waiting for clarity, for permission, for the right time. But life isn't waiting. It's happening right now, and the more we realize that it won't last, the more beautiful it becomes. So maybe death is not a thief, but a mirror, reflecting back the value of every moment we're given. Maybe its role isn't to scare us, but to remind us that this moment is precious precisely because it's passing, that nothing is guaranteed, and that's what makes it sacred. And perhaps the deepest gift death can offer is this: not fear, but urgency. Not sadness, but reverence. The kind of reverence that makes you hold someone's hand a little longer. Speak more gently. Smile at a stranger. Take a breath and really feel it. Because one day, everything you're experiencing right now will become memory or silence. And knowing that is what allows you to love it while it lasts. Learning to die before you die. In Buddhism, there is a quiet but powerful teaching: to die before you die. At first, it sounds strange, even unsettling, but it's not about giving up on life. It's about waking up to it. To die before you die means learning to let go before life forces you to. It means releasing what was never truly yours, so you can meet each moment with honesty, clarity, and peace. Most people spend their lives trying to build something solid: an identity, a future, a legacy. We want to be remembered, admired, understood. And yet, everything we create is temporary. Everything we cling to, status, beauty, certainty, control, will eventually dissolve. Learning to die before you die means facing that truth now, while you're still alive. It means practicing surrender, so that when the final moment comes, it's not a shock. It's simply another breath in the flow of impermanence. There's a kind of death that happens in meditation. Not a physical death, but the quiet dissolving of illusion. When you sit in stillness long enough, with no distractions, the layers begin to peel away. The roles you play, the stories you tell, even the voice in your mind begins to quiet. And what's left is not a blank void, but a clear, open awareness. Spacious, silent, unshaken. That's what it means to die before you die, to return to that which cannot be taken. I once heard a monk describe it like this: every time I let go of something I thought was essential, an opinion, a fear, an identity, I didn't feel emptier, I felt freer. And that's the paradox. What we fear losing is often the very thing weighing us down. What we're scared to release is what's keeping us stuck. The death of ego, of clinging, of self-importance. It's not the end of who we are. It's the beginning of something truer. There's a reason why, in many traditions, monks and nuns wear robes and shave their heads. It's not just symbolism. It's a practice of releasing attachments, letting go of personal style, social rank, even vanity. It's a way of saying, I don't need these things to exist. I am not my hair. I am not my image. I am not my status. I am something deeper. But this practice isn't only for monastics. Every one of us, at some point, must face the letting go. A relationship ends. A job disappears. A chapter closes. And in those moments, we are given a choice: cling and suffer, or release and awaken. Learning to die before you die is learning how to meet change with grace, how to let life move through you without grasping at it. It's about releasing not only what we love, but also what limits us, our resentments, our regrets, our imagined selves. And in doing so, we don't become numb. We become real. We stop living from habit and start living from truth. Thich Nhat Hanh once said, if you learn how to die, you learn how to live. And if you learn how to live, you are not afraid to die. That's the heart of this teaching. The more we practice letting go in small ways, the more prepared we become to let go completely. Not because we've given up, but because we've woken up. To die before you die is to look at life with new eyes, to stop clinging to what's already fading, to bow to the moment as it is, without needing it to be something else. And in that bow, in that surrender, something radical happens. Fear loosens, love deepens, presence expands. Because the truth is, you don't need to wait for death to let go. You can start now. You can breathe out the need to control. You can soften the armor of identity. You can release the idea that you have to prove anything. And when you do, you'll find something waiting beneath all that effort. A stillness, a clarity, a kind of freedom that doesn't come from having more, but from needing less. And perhaps that's the deepest kind of life. Not one where nothing ends, but one where every ending becomes a doorway. A doorway to simplicity, to peace, to what was always here beneath the noise. What the Buddha really taught about death. The Buddha never told us not to be afraid of death. Instead, he invited us to look straight into it, not with denial and not with fantasy, but with clear, steady eyes. He never promised eternal life, or a place in heaven, or a soul that would live forever. What he offered was something far more powerful: freedom, not from death itself, but from the fear of it. In his teachings, death was never a taboo. It wasn't hidden or softened with comforting metaphors. It was part of the practice. He urged his disciples to reflect on death every day, not to make life heavier, but to make it real. He reminded them again and again that the body is impermanent, that everything we grasp will change, and that holding on to what cannot stay is the root of our suffering. One day, a young man named Sabah asked the Buddha why some people live long lives while others die young, why some are happy while others are born into hardship. The Buddha didn't answer with superstition or abstract philosophy. He spoke of causes and conditions, of actions, intentions, and karma, not as a punishment system, but as a natural law. Things arise, things pass. Suffering comes when we expect permanence in a world that constantly shifts. To the Buddha, death wasn't something to solve, it was something to understand. Because once you see death clearly, you begin to live differently. You stop wasting time. You stop pretending you'll be here forever. You begin to ask better questions. Not how can I avoid death, but how can I live so fully that when death comes, I'm not afraid. The Buddha knew that fear of death is really fear of loss. Loss of control, loss of identity, loss of everything we think defines us. But he also knew that what we truly are doesn't depend on any of those things. He taught that we are not fixed selves. We are processes unfolding moment by moment. The body is not permanent. The mind is not permanent. Even consciousness arises and passes. When we cling to any of these as me or mine, we suffer. But when we see through them, we begin to taste a freedom that death cannot touch. There's a teaching in the Dhammapada that says, neither in the sky nor in the middle of the ocean, nor by entering a mountain cave, is there a place where you can escape death. It's not meant to frighten us. It's meant to wake us up, to stop running, to stop building our lives on illusions. Because only when we accept death as part of life can we begin to understand how to live without fear. And the Buddha didn't just teach this with words, he lived it. When he fell ill before his death, he didn't hide it from his disciples. He didn't ask them to pray for a miracle. Instead, he told them to take refuge not in him, but in the Dharma, in the truth, in the path, in their own clear seeing. His final words were simple and direct. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on, with diligence, not because death is a tragedy, but because life is fleeting and we mustn't waste it. What the Buddha really taught about death was never about fear. It was about awakening, about living in a way that leaves nothing unsaid, nothing unloved, nothing unexamined. He wasn't offering escape. He was offering understanding. Because with understanding comes release, and with release comes peace. So we don't need to run from death. We don't need to fight it. We need to turn toward it, gently, bravely, and see it for what it is. A teacher, a mirror, a doorway, and maybe even a friend. A monk's reflection, what death has taught me. I've sat beside many people in their final hours. Some were old, some were young. Some were surrounded by loved ones, others died alone. And in those quiet, irreversible moments, I've seen something deeper than fear, or maybe just beyond it. I've seen the truth of what we all carry inside. The longing not just to survive, but to understand. To know, in the end, that our lives meant something. That we lived well. That we can let go without regret. Death has been my teacher, not in theory, but in presence. I became a monk not because I had all the answers, but because I wanted to stop running from the questions. I wanted to sit still long enough to face what I used to avoid. And again, death brought me back to what's real. It stripped away my assumptions. It showed me what actually matters when all the noise fades away. I've learned that death doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't ask whether you've finished your to-do list. It arrives in its own time. And when it comes, the only thing that seems to matter is how open your heart has been. Not how much you've owned or accomplished, but how much you've loved, how honestly you've lived, how gently you've let go. I've learned that grief has a rhythm. It doesn't obey logic. Sometimes it shows up long after you thought you were done with it. Sometimes it humbles you when you least expect it. And that's okay. Because grief, too, is love that has nowhere to go. It's not a problem to fix. It's a companion to walk with. If you can learn to hold it gently, without turning away, it will teach you how to stay soft in a world that often wants you to be hard. I've learned that the fear of death is, more than anything, the fear of losing control. We cling to our stories, our names, our identities, because we want something to last. But nothing lasts. Not even this body. Not even this breath. And strangely, once I stopped demanding permanence, I began to feel free. Not detached, but unburdened. Not indifferent, but more alive than I'd ever been. Death has taught me to pay attention, to stop waiting for the perfect moment, to answer the call when someone says, "Can you sit with me?" To say, "I love you," without rehearsing it, to not let little things become big walls. It's taught me that every sunrise matters, that the sound of birds in the morning, the way tea feels in your hands, the warmth of a smile from a stranger, all of it is part of the sacred. Not because it lasts, but because it doesn't. And perhaps most of all, death has taught me that we are not as separate as we think. In each goodbye, I've felt how connected we are. How fragile, yes, but also how luminous. We come and go like waves on the ocean, but the ocean remains. And that ocean, whatever name you give it, life, spirit, emptiness, God, is vast enough to hold all of us. So I no longer try to escape death. I sit with it. I walk beside it. I let it speak. And when it does, it doesn't scream or threaten. It whispers. It says, "Slow down. Let go. Be kind. Love what's here while it's here. Because one day it won't be, and neither will you." And that, if you're willing to feel it, isn't something to fear. It's something to honor. Final words. When you accept death, you are free. So if you've come this far, you've already done something rare. You've turned toward a truth that most of us spend our lives trying to avoid. You've listened. You've breathed with it. You've stayed. And maybe, just maybe, something in you feels a little quieter now, a little more open. Maybe the fear has softened, even slightly, into understanding. This wasn't just a talk about death. It was about life, about learning how to live without running, without clinging, without postponing what really matters. It was about recognizing that everything is already passing, and that's what makes it beautiful. We spoke of waves returning to the ocean, of breath that rises and falls, of the candle that burns not to last forever, but to give light while it can. And in the end, that's all we can really do. Burn gently while we're here. Be present while we can. Love while we're still able to say it out loud. If this message touched your heart, I invite you to keep walking this path with me. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like more reflections like this. Like the video if it helped you pause. Share it with someone who may need the comfort of these words. You never know who's quietly waiting for a moment like this. And before you go, take one final breath, gently, fully. And as you exhale, let it carry with it the fear, the rush, the need to hold on. Because when you accept death, not just in theory, but in your heart, you are finally free. Free to live, free to love, free to be here completely.